all wherever you are. And on behalf of UN Water and WHO and myself from UN Habitat, welcome to this session. My name is Graham Alabaster. I'm the Chief of UN Habitat's office in Geneva and responsible for the monitoring work on SDG 6 under 631 as one of the co-custodians with my colleagues in WHO, Rick Johnson and UNSD. This indicator is really a landmark because for the first time under the SDGs, wastewater is being monitored. You're all very familiar with the work of JMP on 621 on the access to water and sanitation, but this is the first time wastewater has appeared in a global goal. And my colleagues and I with WHO, over the past few years, we've been working with the UN system and many partners to develop and refine the methodology for reporting on wastewater. Now, why is this such an important indicator? Not only, of course, from the point of view of protecting public health and the environment, but as we move into a more water scarce world, the reuse of wastewater and protecting scarce water supplies from pollution will become increasingly more important. There's also needs for efficiency gains in the management of wastewater, not only to protect those particular issues, but also, of course, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So wastewater is actually a very, very important indicator. And it's been quite a challenge to develop a good methodology to report on this. We're not quite there yet. We've still got some way to go because the methodologies, of course, are continually being refined. And you might well ask, well, monitoring for the sake of what? Well, the idea is that this indicator is very actionable. And we hope as time progresses to refine our methods and to be able to localize the management and the monitoring of wastewater and its various sources, because wastewater comes from domestic sources, but also services, industrial installations, and other sources. So the challenge really is finding a way to report on those different streams in a way that we can use this as a management tool, but also to have a global picture of what's going on. So this is one of the indicators that really does benefit from also being examined at the local level and used in decision making. So we've got quite a packed program for you today. I'm going to now hand over to my colleague WHO, Rick Johnson, who will sort of talk us through the proceedings a bit and continue with the announcement. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Graham. It's a pleasure to be with you all today to share the results of this progress report on indicator 6.3.1, which is the proportion of domestic and industrial wastewater flows safely treated. As you'll see in the two presentations which will follow, there are separate data and methods for the total and industrial wastewater flows and the domestic wastewater flows. And the first half of today's webinar will focus on presenting the highlights from those two sets of data that are summarized in the progress report. Following that, we'll turn to representatives from 3 countries to learn about how they are engaged in monitoring and managing wastewater treatment at the country level. So just a few housekeeping words before we start. We have translation available on the call today. So please, if you check on the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see an interpretation button, which will allow you to choose between English, French, and Spanish. And we will have inputs in different languages. So please select the language that is most comfortable to you. And second, I'd like to ask everyone to introduce themselves in the chat box. And also, as the presentations go on, if you have any comments or questions or reactions, please put those also in the chat box and we'll make sure to come to them in the discussion session. Also, if you would prefer to make a comment verbally in the discussion section, just raise your hand and we can unmute you to allow you to make your inputs. So with that, I'd like to now show a few words from the Vice Chair of UN Water, Kellyanne Naylor, about the whole of SDG 6 monitoring, and then I'll turn it over to Florian Thévenon, who will start with the total and industrial wastewater. So let me share my screen and hear greetings from Kellyanne Naylor.
Dear colleagues and friends of water, thank you very much for joining this webinar today to discuss progress towards Sustainable Development Goal 6. This webinar is part of a series of webinars taking place this month, each focusing on global progress towards a specific SDG 6 indicator and target. Before we get into the details, I wanted to share a few important messages about overall progress towards SDG 6 and how the UN is working together to report on our progress. We are now 6 years into the SDGs. And for the first time, we have water and sanitation data from almost all the countries in the world. This country data were compiled last year by the UN custodian agencies who joined forces under the UN Water Integrated Monitoring Initiative for SDG 6, or as we fondly call it, IMI SDG 6. The unprecedented level of reporting is a major accomplishment for us as a global community, but even more so for all the country focal points who are joining us in this webinar. On behalf of UN Water, I would like to thank all of you for your extra hard efforts in monitoring SDG 6 in your country this year, especially in the difficult times we've been all living through. When we look at this data, they sadly confirm the tendency that we first saw in 2018, that we are off track to achieve sustainable water and sanitation for all by 2030. Taking a look at some of the hard facts about SDG 6, we see that billions of people worldwide still live without safe water and sanitation and basic hygiene services. Nearly 10% of the world's population still live in areas with extreme water stress. We know that wastewater is being released untreated into the environment, and 1 in 5 of the world's river basins are changing rapidly, which is exacerbated by changes in climate. We see that sustainable management of water resources remains out of reach for many countries. The data show that in order to meet our goals and targets, we are going to need to accelerate progress, and in some areas up to 4 times faster to be able to meet SDG 6 within the next 9 years. More than anything, we're going to need politicians and policymakers at all levels to be able to set bolder priorities and quickly. But the good news is that we already have a lot of sustainable solutions in place. Last year, UN Water launched the SDG 6 Global Acceleration Framework with the full backing of the UN family to mobilize action across government, civil society, and the private sector across the UN to be able to better align our efforts, optimize financing, and enhance capacity and governance. From our work with countries and from their data, we've learned a lot about opportunities for accelerating progress. We've learned about the importance of scaling up capacity building, coordinated action, mobilizing political will. And of course, we've learned how data and information can be used to better guide policy and decision makers in their work. Because despite these heroic monitoring efforts of the last year, we still see large data gaps. Our ambition and hope with this data and with our SDG 6 reports are to further encourage national and subnational data collection and ultimately help policy and decision makers to take informed action. This is what IMI SDG 6 will be focusing on as we go forward, and we call on the entire water community from global to local efforts to join us in taking this forward. I wish you a very fruitful and lively webinar today and very warmly welcome you to join the other indicator webinars that we're organizing this month. Thank you for your attention and for all of your continued efforts to drive progress towards our common goal to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kellyanne. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Florian Thévenot with UN Habitat to share his information about total and industrial wastewater.
You're muted, Florian.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. So I said hello, everyone, and thank you. This session first starts with the total and industrial wastewater flow. So here is a definition of target 6.3 by 2030, improve water quality by reducing pollution, eliminating dumping and minimizing the release of hazardous chemicals and materials, halving the proportion of untreated wastewater and substantially increasing recycling and safe reuse globally. There are two indicators related to this target, 631 on the proportion of wastewater safely treated, and 632 on the proportion of bodies of water with good ambient water quality, and there will be a session on 632 after this one. Here is a representation of the methodology. I can show next slide, yes. Methodology used to monitor indicator 631, focusing on wastewater generated by point sources. The impact of diffuse pollution from non-point sources by runoff is monitored under indicator 632, focusing on ambient water quality. The flow of wastewater generated are disaggregated by sources. You can see on the left where the flow of wastewater treated are disaggregated by type and level of treatment, as I will show on the next slide. It is also including the wastewater flow from independent collecting systems, such as septic tank, that are transported to a treatment plant for safe treatment, as illustrated by the truck here. Some of the wastewater is discharged to the environment without being treated, and sewer generally also collects some runoff water. So UN Habitat is focusing on the total and industrial wastewater statistics using the methodology developed by the United Nations Statistics Division, UNSD, and Eurostat OECD for the European and OECD members. These official statistics are supplied by national statistic offices and our Ministry of Environment or equivalent institutions. Here are the variables used for the generation of wastewater. The industrial fraction is disaggregated by economic activity using the International Standard Industrial Classification of All Economic Activity, ISIC, for mining and quarrying, manufacturing, electricity, but excluding cooling water and construction. The domestic fraction can be disaggregated by household and services, and agriculture excludes non-point sources such as runoff and irrigation. Here are the variables used for the treatment of wastewater. The other treatment plants include the treatment of wastewater in any non-public treatment plant, for instance, industry, which have their own treatment facilities. The independent treatment facility are not connected to a wastewater collection system and include septic tank. You can see on the right the breakdown according to the three levels of treatment. So the results now, this figure presents the volume generated from the 56 countries who reported in 2015 using a logarithmic scale. The total volume corresponds to 132 billion cubic meter. This histogram is showing the disaggregation of the flows of wastewater generated by economic activity and household from European members only, without going into detail of this figure, just to show that some countries are not reporting on most variable, and that there is more blue, which correspond to domestic water supply, which is more reported than industrial water generation, wastewater generation by industry. This figure presents the volume treated from the 57 countries who reported in 2015. The total volume corresponds to 42 billion cubic meters. The disaggregation on the right for the country reporting to UNSD also show high heterogeneity in the variable and more data from urban wastewater treatment plant also in blue here. This is the proportion of the total wastewater treated as required for the indicator. So there is less countries than on the previous slide because some countries did not report on both generation and treatment, so that the ratio could not be calculated in some cases. Some country proportion were higher than 100%, most likely because an improved monitoring of the wastewater flow treated, especially in municipal wastewater treatment plant, which can treat an important proportion of runoff water, as well as some water generated from non-public drinking water network. Among the 42 countries reporting on both total wastewater generation and treatment, 32% of the total wastewater flow receive at least some treatment, whereas the proportion of the safely treated wastewater, which means at least secondary treatment in blue here, account for 17% based on the 15 countries that report this variable to UNSD. Because this variable did not exist until this year into the two other databases, which are Eurostat and OECD. So for the 14 countries that reported on industrial wastewater generated and treated, a third of the flow received at least some treatment, and only 3 countries reported in blue on safely treated industrial wastewater to UNSD. So a major finding is therefore the low data coverage, which does not allow to provide regional and global estimates. This diagram is comparing the volume of wastewater reported in blue on the left with the proportion of the population covered by the population of the country who reported in gray on the right. The 56 and 57 countries reporting on total wastewater generated and treated correspond to 20% of the global population. This is these two gray bars here. And the 32 and 15 countries reporting on industrial wastewater flow generated and treated correspond to only 12 and 3% of the world population. In addition to the low number of reporting countries, this figure presenting the water consumption in Switzerland points out the absence of reporting of self-supply water resources in the national statistics, which in general exclusively focus on public drinking water supply. As a consequence, the water consumption by economic activities such as trade, industry, and agriculture are in general not included in the annual statistic, while they extract and generate substantial quantity of water and wastewater. In Switzerland, over a third of the potable water is used privately, especially by the business and industry sector, shown by this arrow on the right here. Non-municipal discharges, which include self-supply industry and those that are discharged directly without being collected by sewerage systems, represent a high proportion of the total wastewater flow, but also of the pollutant discharged to the environment. This data from Mexico shows that the volume of wastewater generated and treated by municipal in dark blue and non-municipal in light blue are in the same order of magnitude. This is the left part. However, much more biochemical oxygen demand, BOD in the right part, is yes, BOD is an indicator of the concentration of organic matter, so of pollution, as we may know. But you can see that much more BOD is generated and discharged by non-municipal sources in light blue, despite the fact that the volume are almost equivalent, or at least in the same order of magnitude. This figure represents the relative loads of BOD in Costa Rica by economic activities as a percentage of the total BOD related to wastewater discharge. Agriculture and livestock represent 41%, food production 25%, discharge of wastewater and sludge only 12%, retail trade 6%, and other economic activities 17%. This data therefore also demonstrates the importance of filling the existing gaps on commercial and industrial wastewater discharge to the environment. Firstly, because industry should represent a much higher proportion of the total wastewater flow, and secondly, because of the important quantity of organic and chemical pollutant that are discharged by industrial activity negatively impact ambient water quality as monitored by indicator 632. So to conclude, on the total and industrial statistic reported by the country to the international database, in 2015, only 42 countries covering 18% of the global population reported some statistic on wastewater generation and treatment. This limited data suggests that about a third of total and industrial wastewater receive some treatment before discharge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian, for a very clear presentation. I'd like to now move next to Andrew Chantz, who will present on the domestic wastewater treatment. I'll also just note that that I've put up a link in the chat box to the full report, so you can download that. We will have translations coming up soon. And just to encourage people to put your questions or comments in the chat box so that we can come to them during the questions and answers, which will follow Andrew's presentation. Andrew, go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rick. I'm just going to share my screen here and I'll just seek your confirmation that that's showing up okay. Is that showing up there?
Yes, we see it.
Great, great, very good. Well, hello and welcome once again. My name is Andrew Chantz and I'm a consultant with WHO. As Rick mentioned from the outset, the domestic wastewater indicator is presented separately from that for total and industrial flows. And that is because WHO employs a distinct methodology where we also utilize assumptions in addition to reported data to fill in data gaps in cases where data is not available. And we also collect data from additional official sources beyond the UNSD, Eurostat, and OECD data repositories that were mentioned previously by Florian. So getting into the methodology, the main output of the indicator is the proportion of domestic wastewater that is safely treated. And this is presented for countries and for territories, but can also be aggregated at regional and global levels. So formally, the term domestic includes flows from both households and services. And services in this context is defined as institutions and businesses. However, in practice, we've found that flows that are disaggregated by services are in fact very rarely reported. And therefore, to date, we've decided for the domestic component of the indicator to only cover household-related flows. So the four main parts of the methodology are shown here in the diagram, and we'll discuss each of these components individually. So the first step of the methodology is to determine the total volume of household wastewater that is generated for a particular country, and which is either directly reported by official national statistics, that's essentially option 1, or as an option 2 is estimated internally by WHO. So if the data is not directly reported by a host country through official statistics and is instead estimated by WHO, we utilize in that calculation a function of the country's population, its domestic water use, and the ratio of water use to wastewater produced. Then subsequently, the total volume of household wastewater generated is then disaggregated into 3 different wastewater streams. So the first stream consists of households with sewer connections. The second stream consists of households with septic tank connections. And the third stream is a grouping of households with all other types of sanitation facilities. So this disaggregation relies quite heavily on data from the Joint Monitoring Program, the JMP, which has estimated the proportion of every country's population that uses these 3 different classifications of sanitation facilities. And this is, of course, very relevant to SDG indicator 6.2.1, of which there was a separate webinar presented yesterday. So subsequently, the proportions of wastewater flow that are contained and then subsequently collected at treatment systems, and then subsequently safely treated within those treatment systems are estimated for the sewer and septic tank wastewater streams. So it's important to note also that flows that are produced by households without sewer or septic tank connections have been classified in their entirety as not having been safely treated. So these variables covering these components that I mentioned, containment, collection, and treatment, are represented here in what we call a household wastewater management chain. So on the left, you can see the 3 different wastewater streams mentioned earlier. Households with sewer connections, number 1, households with septic tanks, number 2, and households with all other forms of sanitation under stream 3. And then subsequently looking at the sewer wastewater stream, a proportion of sewer wastewater is subsequently collected at treatment plants. Sorry, I have some graphics here that are perhaps not showing up. Just give me one moment. There we are. So we have a proportion of generated flows, generated sewer flows that are collected at treatment plants, after which a proportion is then safely treated before discharge. So we consider the definition of safely treated to be essentially meeting discharge compliance standards. However, this data on discharge compliance is not always available. So if it is missing for a particular country, we also consider secondary or higher treatment processes to be considered safely treated as a proxy. So looking now at septic tanks, we can see in the diagram that a proportion can be delivered to centralized treatment facilities. A proportion can also be treated within the septic tank system itself, and a proportion may not be adequately treated at all. And these variables are also captured within the model. So it's important to note that the country calculations rely on 20 different input variables, and we often do not have nationally representative data for all of these variables for all countries. So as mentioned from the outset, we've generated a set of assumptions which are used when we're missing data for any of these 20 variables. And we've also set some criteria, some thresholds, which limit the influence of these assumptions. So if these assumptions apply to too much of a proportion of wastewater flows, we're unable to generate a country estimate. And therefore, we don't generate country estimates for all countries, only those which satisfy this criteria. So finally, the last step is to calculate the overall flow, the overall volume of safely treated wastewater by multiplying the proportions safely treated from step 3 by the total wastewater volumes generated from each stream from step 2. So the safely treated volumes for sewer and septic tank streams are then summed, and then finally the proportion of wastewater generated that has been safely treated is computed to give us the country estimate. So moving on now to what I think is much more interesting, the results of our analysis. Here on the right side, we can see the percentage breakdown of estimated household wastewater flows generated across the 3 different streams. So here we see 57% of wastewater was generated by sewer connected households, 24% by those with septic tanks, and 19% by those with all other types of sanitation. Next, we reveal that same breakdown across the SDG regions, and we can see that sewer wastewater is dominant across most of the regions, with the exception of Central and Southern Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where septic tanks and other forms of sanitation are much more common. So these estimates of wastewater generated were produced for all 234 countries and regions covered by SDG monitoring. Now looking at the proportion of household wastewater that has been safely treated according to our estimations. At the global level, we've estimated that 56% of all household flows were safely treated in 2020. And revealing the regional data here, it's quite clear that there's a lot of variability between the regions, with very low proportion of safely treated flows in Sub-Saharan Africa, Central and Southern Asia, and to some extent in Latin America and the Caribbean as well. So this slide here demonstrates the breakdown of collected and safely treated flows, now looking exclusively at sewer and septic tank streams individually. So firstly, at the top, looking at the sewer stream, we see here that 10% of flows were not collected, 12% of flows were collected but not safely treated at treatment plants, and 78% of flows were collected and safely treated. So therefore, the majority of flows, 78%, that ended up in sewers were therefore safely treated. And within the septic tank stream below, 49% of flows were not collected, 3% of flows were collected and removed off-site, but without safe treatment, 13% of flows were collected and safely treated off-site, and 35% were collected and safely treated on-site. So here, only about half of all flows in the septic tank stream were safely treated. And this is mainly resulting from the fact that many septic tanks were estimated as not having completely contained the flows within the septic tank system. So in this very short overview presentation, we've just essentially scratched the surface of the methodology and the results from the 2020 update. So for those of you that would like to dive a little bit deeper, there's much more information available on the results and the implications of the data in the recently published indicator report that Rick made reference to, and is available. The link is available in the chat box. And further information can also be found on our methodology in a detailed note that covers in much more detail all of the calculations, the terminology, and the definitions and rules and exceptions that we've applied to generating the estimates. And that methodology will soon be available on the SDG 6 website. And then finally, we've produced individual country files for all 234 countries and territories. And this includes all the country-specific data, the references, and the assumptions that we've used in place of missing data, as well as all the raw calculations and various summaries of the data in those country files. And those country files, I think Rick will share a link for those as well. They're not quite live. They'll be live in the next couple of days, but you can hang on to that link and check that in the next couple of days to find your particular country's country file for the domestic component of indicator 6.3.1. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And now is the time where we have opportunity for comments, questions, and reactions. If anyone would like to make a comment, please raise your hand and we can unmute you, or feel free to type slides into the chat box, and Florian, Andrew, or one of our team here will respond to them. I do see that there are already a few questions in the question and answer that I think Florian has already answered in that box. But Florian, could I ask you to summarize the two questions that you've already managed, just so that everyone is able to hear them? In the meantime, others can write their questions in the chat.
Yeah, sure. I don't see them again. It disappears once I answer, but it was about the rainwater management and the definition of rainwater, because the question was saying that rainwater is not wastewater. Of course, I'm an environmentalist and I have the same reaction, but from a perspective, and the definition can be different according to the different methodology and frameworks. But in our definition, wastewater is considered, rainwater is considered as rainwater only once it's collected and entering into the sewage system. Otherwise, when you are looking at the basin, rainwater is of course not considered as wastewater, but once it's collected, it's going to the wastewater treatment plant. It's of course a case when you have a combined sewer system, but also even in separate system, you can have a lot of water. Sometimes half of the wastewater collected is runoff water, but it's mixed with wastewater, so it's treated like wastewater. It's also used to delete the pollutant. And the second remark was on the importance of the management of runoff water. Yes, of course, it's crucial. It's crucial, like a safe wastewater reuse, and it's crucial to capture this important resource and to manage it as an important resource. Yeah, no doubt about that. I don't know if I answer well. Thank you.
No, very much. And I think the question of rainwater management is really critical. It can be quite difficult in accounting for waters to manage rainwater or more generally surface water runoff. And sometimes we do find difficulties on the data side where the volumes of water received at wastewater treatment plants may be in some cases even larger than the volumes that are reported to be generated, because those sewer lines do capture rainwater and surface runoff, especially in countries where combined sewers are still dominant. I think in general, the methods for monitoring wastewater are still developing, and definitely the degree to which countries are able to report on the different types of wastewater generated and treated are still developing, and we expect to see improvements in time as we continue to update this global database and issue new progress reports. The next one planned to be in 2 years. And we do also hope to be able to go into more detail about aspects of the target, such as wastewater reuse, that aren't formally part of the indicator, but are still really relevant to the target. I'd like to turn to Graham from UN Habitat, just to give a few reflections on where we are now and where we see going in the coming years with this initiative around wastewater reporting. And then we're going to turn to the inputs from the 4 countries that we have available today. But please do continue to enter any questions, and we'll either respond to them in the chats or take them live after Graham makes his comments.
Thank you very much, Rick, and thank you indeed for the 2 presentations. I think now I'm sure some of you know this already, that we're up against quite a complex challenge, and really we need to move forward with refining our methods, both on the domestic side and on the non-domestic and municipal side. There are moves, and we've been planning to work at the local level a bit more, to work with some of you, some utilities and other local level partners, to see how we might get some further information on using local level data and water and wastewater data from utilities to help us make better estimates. And we really rely on you from the countries to guide us and help us on that. If any of you are interested in working with us more closely and having a sort of closer look at what's actually happening at the local level, we would be very pleased to work with you. But I think really the future is very clear. We've made a start. We still have a long way to go. You can see, particularly for the total and the industrial wastewater, that a minuscule number of countries are reporting. Now, we know that a lot of that data is available at local level and sometimes at national level, but it's not finding its way into the databases. So it's really quite important that we work to support that process. And of course, Habitat and WHO and UNSD will be very happy to discuss that with statistical offices or other actors at the local level. But we've made a good start. We rely on you to support you. We rely on your feedback to enable us to support you better and to refine our methodologies. And let's hope that maybe it's a bit optimistic, but by 2030, but let's hope that certainly within the next, the remaining years, that we make some significant steps forward and we move way beyond that very small percentage of countries that are reporting. I think I'll stop there and move to the next part of the program. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Graham. And absolutely, the point is that we do have data gaps. We're looking to fill those data gaps, but the aim of the monitoring is not to have complete databases. It's to have countries using data to inform programming and practice. So that's going to be the topic of our next section of the program, where we're going to have inputs from South Africa, from Costa Rica, from Peru, and from Zambia. So we have a number of country inputs to get through. So I'm going to ask our country representatives to keep to the time. You've got about 10 minutes each. And I'm going to invite Tembi Masalela and Jorgo van Wyk, from South Africa to start us off. And I believe that, Tembi, are you going to share your screen and slides?
No, Mr. Van Wyk will share from his side.
Okay, please go ahead then. The floor is yours.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Tembi Masalela. I'm from South Africa, and I'm the task leader for SDG target 6.3. Thank you for the opportunity for allowing our country to showcase what we have done or the approach that we have done in terms of the SDG indicator 631. And I will be presenting with Mr. Jaco van Wyk, who is our technical advisor and the author of our methodology report. And allow me also to acknowledge the technical contributions from the team, which is Ms. Enele, Mr. Makate, Mr. Malefane, Ms. Next slide, Mr. Van Wyk. My presentation content, it only shows two folds. The first fold will be the approach, how we did it as South Africa, the SDG 6.3. And Mr. Van Wyk will take us through to the technical support in terms of the methodology, data and data sources, the challenges, solutions and lessons learned, also the indicator 631 results. Going to the next slide, which is the approach for the department. How did we start? The Department of Water and Sanitation, on behalf of the water sector in South Africa, is responsible for the management and reporting on goal number 6. After the first data drive in 2016, as the country or as the department, we saw the need to follow the processes to ensure that efficient and frequent reporting on progress on towards the meeting the targets, as well as effective mainstreaming of the SDG into DWS, which is the department workflow. Subsequently to that, the task teams were established for each of the 8 SDG 6 targets, including SDG target number 6.3. And also the SDG 6 working group was also established to coordinate and obtain the feedback on the progress made by each of the task teams. Each task team is supported by a number of specialists in the relevant field. The responsibility or the task teams are responsible for interrogating where it is necessary, also to develop or domesticate methodologies for reporting on the SDGs. Also, the task teams are responsible for collecting data and reporting on the trends towards achieving the SDGs, and to identify the data gaps and the potential solutions, and also to identify the key action that needs to be taken up into policy and strategy to achieve the SDGs. Over the past years, the SDG 6.3 task team has undertaken these actions through specialist assessment and stakeholder engagement, which will be outlined in the next few slides. I thank you. I'll hand over to our Mr. Van Wyk, the technical advisor.
Thank you, colleague. I'm going to continue straight away. We have documented the South African approach to all the SDG target 6.3 indicators in the report that you can see on the screen. It is believed that the intentions of the SDG program have been retained, even if having customized some terminology and if having refined the approaches for our local conditions. And then finally, the report that you see on the screen had also been peer-reviewed by a panel of 3 external experts sponsored by the Academy of Science of South Africa. The next slide that you see on the screen now provides a very good overview of the indicators that we use in South Africa to gauge performance against target 6.3 on wastewater and water quality. You would recognize the top one, which is the indicator that we're talking about, 631 on wastewater, and then the bottom one as well on 632, which is about good ambient water quality. On top of this, we have added 3 additional indicators to address the full ambition of target 6.3. So for the wastewater picture, we've added indicator on recycling and reuse, And then we have also mirrored this, these two indicators on top for waste. So we have an indicator for waste disposal and also an indicator for the recycling and reuse of waste. Now, collectively, the top 4 indicators are termed or called sources of impacts, which then ultimately impact on the receiving water resource, which is gauged by indicator 632. There's a lot more that one could say here, but I'm going to go on in terms of, in the interest of time. Zooming in straight away on global or on the indicator 631, people are aware or know the global wording. So what we've done in the domestication of 631 is to substitute wastewater. So it reads for us a proportion of water containing waste. And we've also substituted safely treated with lawfully discharged. So that was done to correspond with our local arrangements and the language that we use in policy and legislation. In the table, there's a normative interpretation of the individual phrases of the domesticated indicator, proportion of water containing waste, and then the one that I would like to give a little bit more time to is the lawfully discharged. There's a diagram here at the bottom that very succinctly describes what is meant by lawfully discharged in South Africa. Now, to be lawfully discharged or to lawfully discharge requires 2 important ingredients. First of all, that discharge must be permissible in terms of our legislation, implying that there must be an entitlement or a water use authorization in place. And then secondly, such effluent discharge needs to be compliant with the conditions that are stipulated in the entitlement or in the water use authorization, and then specifically the waste discharge standards. So in a nutshell, for the discharge of effluent to be lawful, it needs to have an authorization and it needs to comply with the waste discharge standards stipulated in that authorization. And if it ticks both of these boxes, it will contribute or add towards indicator 631D. To complete our methodology, for the purpose of SDG indicator 631 reporting, wastewater handling in South Africa falls into one of 2 categories. First of all, these 2 boxes on the left. So that is the municipal category. And then on the right is the non-municipal category. So let's first quickly look at the municipal side of things, which is dealt with a little bit different because of our legislative setup and the different pieces of legislation that are concerned. So here we distinguish between commercial and industrial activities that discharge to a municipal wastewater treatment works. Now, in South Africa, it's difficult to distinguish between domestic and the different input sources, but because of the poor condition generally of the effluent that's produced by municipal wastewater treatment works, we have opted for this option as well to try to get more information on the industrial and commercial effluent that is being sent to the municipal sewer network systems, and to see whether there's any correlations that we can use to improve the performance. Then secondly, in the municipal sector, there's the effluent that leaves the wastewater treatment works and that's being discharged to the water resource. And lastly, there could be other industrial activities or commercial activities that treat and discharge directly to a water resource. So that is basically then the 3 sub-indicators. Sub-indicator, the first one would be the proportion of water containing waste lawfully discharged by commercial or industrial activities via sewer network systems. The next one is proportion of water containing waste lawfully discharged by municipal wastewater treatment works to a water resource. And the last one is the same, but it's for non-municipal wastewater treatment works discharge into a water resource.
Mr. Van Wyk, let me just interrupt for a second. This is really a wonderful example, but I'm a little bit worried about time. Would you be able to wrap up your slides in 1 or 2 minutes so that we have time for the other 3 countries to share? Because we do have a hard exit with the next webinar following on this one.
Yes, in terms of data, let me shortly mention that we've got a data system. We soon realized that we need a management system to assist us. The data that is needed is not just restricted to volume and water quality. We also need to have other data such as coordinates, etc., to allow us to use this program for management purposes. We've identified 8 challenges. First of all, it's difficult to distinguish between domestic and industrial water use in the municipal sector. Our database is relatively new, so the data histories are short. We don't readily have access to electronic data. Some is submitted in hard copy. It is likely that water uses exist that we don't know about, so that is influencing calculating the proportions, capacity issues, infrastructure issues, room for collaboration, and then compliance monitoring capacity is restricted. In terms of the solutions, we domesticated the indicators, so that helped us. There's regulations that now force, that's being prepared to force the electronic submission of information. There's a study that must be done to verify and validate where the users are. I'm going to skip through this. Then in terms of lessons learned, it should not be, the SDG program should not be an add-on, so it should be integrated as part of our day-to-day business. Although there's a requirement to aggregate upwards for global reporting, it's also important that you should be able to disaggregate for local management purposes. I've already alluded to the supporting information. It's very important that we break the silos and start to work with other government departments if we want to accelerate this process of getting to sustainable development. Reporting results must be tied to an mainstreamed international and regional planning processes. Water is integral to the entire SDG program, and a strong governance structure is necessary to mainstream the institutionalized ambitions of the SDG program. And then lastly, it's too onerous to calculate by hand, so you need information systems. Thank you very much.
Thanks to both of you, Mr. Van Wyk and Thembi. That was really rich, and I do apologize that we had to curtail it. I would love to spend more time on this one. I do wonder if the report that you mentioned, Jorgo, is available on the internet anywhere. If you could share a link to that, I'm sure people would be very interested in reading up in that in more detail. And if you'd be willing to share your slides also, we'd be happy to share those with people afterwards, since we didn't really have time to get into them all. But I think the issues you raised of looking at the global framework, adapting it to the national context, setting and monitoring national standards, using them to take corrective actions are really, really excellent examples. So thank you very much for that. But I'd like to turn next to Costa Rica, where we have Ana Victoria Giusti Mendez, who will take us through example from Costa Rica. And again, if you could please keep it to about 10 minutes so we have time for all 4 countries. Please, Ana Victoria.
Buenos días, ¿me escuchan?
Yes, we can.
Ok, voy a compartir pantalla. ¿La están viendo?
Yes, we see it. You could go to presentation mode though. Perfect.
Lo voy a poner en modo de presentación. Ok. ¿Ya la están viendo en modo de presentación?
Yes, it's perfect.
Ok. Ok, muchas gracias. Bueno, ya sabemos que es un poquito, un tiempo, ¿verdad? Cortito, 10 minutos. Sin embargo, bueno, vamos a tratar de darle a usted la experiencia en Costa Rica, que es lo que hacemos nosotros en Costa Rica. Bueno, por los que no me conocen, yo soy Ana Victoria Justi Méndez, trabajo en el Ministerio de Salud, en la dirección ambiental, ¿verdad? La idea es compartirles a ustedes cómo en Costa Rica, ¿verdad? Nosotros monitoreamos y podemos lograr hacer informes en aguas residuales con el fin de poder cumplir, o ¿verdad? Con el indicador del ODS 63.1, que es la proporción de aguas residuales tratadas de manera segura. Sin embargo, para Costa Rica, el indicador nuestro es proporción de aguas residuales por origen y tipo de tratamiento. Así rápidamente, yo creo que hay que hablar un poquito de la parte legal, ¿verdad? El respaldo legal que tenemos en Costa Rica para nosotros lograr, ¿verdad? Hacer este monitoreo y esos informes en aguas residuales. Primeramente, así rápidamente, tenemos la Ley General de Salud, ¿verdad? La que en su capítulo 3 es la que nos ampara, ¿verdad? Que nosotros tenemos injerencia o rectoría en la parte de aguas residuales. Luego tenemos la Ley de Conservación de Vida Silvestre, que es del 92. Esta es importantísima porque el artículo 128, ¿verdad? Es el que indica, ¿verdad? Que en Costa Rica se prohíbe arrojar aguas hervidas negras o, bueno, contaminar lo que son los cuerpos de agua, como manantiales, ríos, quebradas, arroyos, etcétera, ¿verdad? Y por otro lado, nos señala que toda instalación, tanto agroindustrial, industrial, como cualquier otra instalación, debe estar provistas de sistemas de tratamiento. O sea, que todas estas actividades en Costa Rica deben tratar sus aguas residuales. Y por último, nos señala que hay que dar una certificación de la calidad de agua residual y se le encomienda al Ministerio de Salud, ¿verdad? Que nosotros tenemos que dar esa certificación de la calidad del agua residual. Por otro lado, tenemos, yo creo que es el más, digamos, el más importante o el centro de la parte de aguas residuales, que es el decreto 33601, que lo firma Salud, ¿verdad? Y lo firma el MINAE, que es el Ministerio de Ambiente, y que es el reglamento de vertido y reuso de aguas residuales. Ese es del 2007, ¿verdad? Es la última versión que tenemos. Y el objetivo de este reglamento, importantísimo, es que ese reglamento establece límites máximos permisibles de parámetros físico-químicos, microbiológicos para disponer las aguas residuales y establecer las pautas de control y cumplimiento. Este reglamento establece en su articulado la obligación de que todo ente generador de aguas residuales debe presentar, o sea, debe confeccionar y presentar reportes operacionales de sus aguas residuales de forma puede ser trimestral, semestral, cualquiera de los dos, dependiendo de su caudal del efluente, pero cuando ese efluente es vertido a un cuerpo receptor le llamamos ríos, lagunas, esteros, etcétera, cuando es a un alcantarillado sanitario o cuando sus aguas se disponen a un reuso. O sea, en este decreto se establecen diferentes tipos de reuso, principalmente lo que son en zonas verdes, en campos de golf, en cultivos, en construcción, etcétera. Y esos reportes se presentan en el Ministerio de Salud. Aquí nada más lo que es el alcantarillado sanitario es un control que se tiene, pero generalmente las aguas que se descargan al alcantarillado sanitario no son aguas tratadas, ¿verdad? Porque se supone, ¿verdad?, que los entes administradores del alcantarillado sanitario en Costa Rica cuentan con sus plantas de tratamiento. Entonces, eso significa que todas esas aguas residuales que van a un cuerpo receptor o las se reusan son aguas tratadas. O sea, todo lo que el Ministerio de Salud, digamos, en las estadísticas que nosotros damos son aguas residuales tratadas. También establece que estos reportes se deben generar en una plataforma que es el Sistema Informático para el Registro de Reportes Operacionales, que es el famoso CIROAR. Más adelante lo vamos a ver muy rápidamente. Dentro de los parámetros que establece este decreto, ¿verdad?, que se deben de monitorear, son los parámetros universales. Como siempre, se tiene que medir caudal, temperatura, pH, DBOs, de cubos, sólidos suspendidos totales, sólidos cementales, grasas y aceites. También establece parámetros complementarios, nitrógeno, fosfato, fenoles, hidrocarburos, metales, plaguicidas y otros. Y también establece el monitoreo de análisis microbiológicos, como son los nematodos y los coliformes fecales. Obviamente el decreto, ¿verdad? Como lo dijimos anteriormente, también establece que se debe emitir una certificación de la calidad de agua residual, que es anualmente. Luego hay un artículo en este reglamento donde dice que el Ministerio de Salud debe hacer estadísticas de cumplimiento de esos parámetros, ¿verdad? Ver cómo se comportan. Y por último, les quiero comentar que este decreto también establece la creación de un comité técnico de vertido y reuso de aguas residuales, que este comité es un comité más que todo de consulta y es el que actualmente estamos trabajando, ¿verdad? Con la coordinación del Ministerio de Salud. En este momento se está reformando este reglamento de vertido desde el 2007. Ahí vamos ahí por buen camino y tiene pues algunas variaciones, entre las cuales tenemos, digamos, por ejemplo, aquí no se contemplan los contaminantes emergentes, ya lo vamos a establecer en este reglamento y algunas otras modificaciones y otros ajustes. Quería compartirles, digámosle así, un ejemplo que en este decreto, ¿verdad? El de vertido establece tanto el parámetro como el límite de los diferentes parámetros que establece, que les dije ahora que son como 8 parámetros universales y entre todos son como unos 50 parámetros que establece el reglamento. Entonces, por ejemplo, aquí el reglamento establece los límites cuando va a un cuerpo receptor, establece los límites cuando van al reuso y establece límites cuando va a un alcantarillado sanitario. Por ejemplo, aquí vemos a la izquierda, digámosle, los parámetros universales, que son de los primeros, pero por otro lado tenemos aquí, por ejemplo, el nitrógeno, hidrocarburos, mercurio. Generalmente los límites son un poco diferentes cuando van a un alcantarillado sanitario, que son un poco más flexibles. Nada más así rápidamente, digámosle, como les dije, los reportes operacionales se deben generar en una plataforma que se le llamamos el CIROAR, que es que gracias a ese sistema es que nosotros podemos hacer las estadísticas. En nada más quería pues comentarles que en este caso, ¿verdad? Todo ente generador, todo, ¿verdad? Que tenga que presentar reportes operacionales, el Ministerio de Salud le asigna un código único que es como la cédula de identificación de aquí en las personas. Luego por aquí de una vez asignado ese código y que tiene su usuario y su contraseña, la persona que va a generar el reporte, ¿verdad? Aquí genera el reporte. Este reporte es presentado, enviado o en físico o entregado al Ministerio de Salud en los niveles locales. El Ministerio de Salud tiene 82 niveles locales, ¿verdad? Que están en los cantones de nuestro país. Aquí se verifica que ese reporte venga completo y se le da un número de trámite para que luego pase a otro proceso, que son los profesionales que revisan esos reportes operacionales y posteriormente ellos emiten la certificación de la calidad del agua residual. Entonces, toda la información que se ingresa por esta plataforma, ¿verdad? Va a quedar en ese sistema. Entonces, ese sistema, ¿verdad? Que es el sistema informático para el registro de reportes operacionales en aguas residuales, se creó en el 2016. Bueno, como lo dije anteriormente, es un sistema mediante el cual se generan estos reportes operacionales. Ahí mismo también se genera la certificación de la calidad del agua residual, de acuerdo al decreto 33601. Es un sistema principalmente de almacenamiento de datos y que después los podemos producir en un Excel. Gracias a este sistema nosotros podemos realizar las estadísticas de conformidad con el artículo 10 del reglamento de vertido, que más que todo tiene que ver con análisis de parámetros y límites de cumplimiento de acuerdos a las actividades económicas. Luego a este sistema, gracias, podemos hacer los reportes anuales de los entes operadores del alcantarillado sanitario cuando esas aguas residuales se descargan a estos entes. Y luego, obviamente, podemos hacer reportes a diferentes instituciones gubernamentales como la parte de municipalidades y universidades. Y por último, por este sistema, nosotros podemos generar estadísticas anuales de agua residual tratada en Costa Rica para el Comité Técnico Institucional de Estadísticas del Agua. Hacemos las estadísticas de los formularios de la OCDE, de la FAO, del DENUPENUMA, del ODS 3.1, cuentas ambientales y otros. O sea, gracias por este sistema, nosotros podemos generar esas estadísticas. Así a grandes rasgos, nada más así pequeñito. Esto es lo que nosotros jalamos o podemos descargar de ese sistema del CIRROAR. Es como unas 75 variables, ¿verdad? Entonces, por ejemplo, aquí podemos ver, digamos así, el código lente generador. Aquí se generan todos los reportes que se generan en un año. Digámosle, un ente generador puede generar 2, 3, hasta 4 reportes por año. Aquí todo este Excel lo va a recopilar, ¿verdad? Tenemos datos generales como el sitio, dónde está ubicado, el tipo de agua residual, a dónde lo disponen, ¿verdad? Si es un cuerpo receptor, si reusa, si va a un alcantarillado sanitario. Luego por acá vemos todos los análisis que se realizaron de los diferentes parámetros, ya sea universales, por ejemplo, caudal, grasas, aceites, lo que es hidrocarburos, la parte de arsénico, la parte plaguicida, la parte de la parte microbiológica. O sea, es un Excel bastante, por ejemplo, por año. Cada año tenemos más recopilación. Por ejemplo, el año 2020, que es el último que tenemos aproximadamente unos 7,000 reportes operacionales que puede corresponder como a unos 3,500 entes generadores que están reportando. Por ejemplo, aquí le quería traer un ejemplo del tipo de estadísticas que nosotros hacemos, pero en este caso es para en sí el reglamento, ¿verdad? Entonces, por ejemplo, esto es un ejemplo que traemos de rellenos sanitarios. Eso lo estamos haciendo para los grupos más importantes de Costa Rica. Por ejemplo, este ejemplo es de rellenos sanitarios, donde podemos con los datos que nos genera este sistema, calcular el promedio, el promedio por cada uno de los parámetros, la desviación, los datos superiores, la cuenta, el porcentaje de incumplimiento, el valor máximo y mínimo, y por otro lado los cuartiles de cumplimiento de un 25 o 50% de cada uno de los parámetros establecidos en el reglamento y por actividades económicas, o sea, por los grupos más importantes de Costa Rica. Por ejemplo, luego, es que no veo hoy, nosotros hacemos estadísticas para el CTI, que es el CTI Agua, que son las estadísticas del Comité Técnico del Agua. Estas son un poco de estadísticas diferentes. Aquí igual, aquí lo trabajamos por grupo de actividad económica. Reportamos volúmenes anuales, ¿verdad? Por cada una, por cada una de las actividades. Y por otro lado, también reportamos las emisiones totales de DBO, sólidos suspendidos totales, sedimentables, grasas, aceites, SAN y de cubo. Aquí es importante, tal vez, nosotros hacemos estadísticas por aparte de esto mismo, tanto cuando es para reuso como cuando va a un cuerpo receptor, ¿verdad? Las podemos hacer por aparte y esto lo reportamos anualmente.
Excuse me, Ana Victoria, I hate to interrupt, but I wonder if you could just say some concluding remarks. It's a very nice example of a database, but we need to move on to the next example.
Ok, ya está la última. Ok, y por último tenemos aquí que podemos llenar, ¿verdad? Lo que es el ODS 3.1, ¿verdad? Que gracias a estas estadísticas nosotros podemos llenar esta información. Obviamente esta información no solo es del Ministerio de Salud, tenemos de otras instituciones, ¿verdad? Que es del INEC y como instituciones operadores de alcantarillado sanitario. Digamos, gracias, así es como nosotros podemos llenar las estadísticas. Y por otro lado tenemos, bueno, tal vez ya no da tiempo, que es la Política Nacional de Aguas Residuales. Y entre los retos que tenemos ya es ampliar la captura de esa información de entes generadores, mejora continua de este sistema, el CIRROAR, y posteriormente incorporar este CIRROAR a un sistema de registro de emisiones, transferencias de contaminantes emergentes a mediano o largo plazo que está trabajando Costa Rica, y contar en algún momento con un sistema informático único sectorial y operando en línea con el 100% de la totalidad de los vertidos y reusos de aguas residuales. Okay. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Ana Victoria. It's really a very impressive example of a complete database where you have data on all the different aspects of wastewater, which can be disaggregated by different economic activities, by agriculture, by domestic waste, by septic tanks over different time periods, looking at compliance with different standards. It's very impressive, so congratulations. And I do apologize for cutting you short. If you do have any materials available online, please put them in the chat box so that others could explore the website in more detail. But with that, I'd like to, if you could stop sharing your screen, please, Ana Victoria. We'll turn next to colleagues from Peru, where we have Mr. Carballo Navarro from the Ministry of Housing, Construction, and Sanitation. And Mr. Carballo, I have your slides, so I'll be sharing my screen in just 1 second. Let's see. Okay, you see it? Okay, I think you've shared your screen, but please, if you could keep to 10 minutes and cover the sanitation and wastewater and not the drinking water sections. Thank you.
The slide disappeared. Ah, yes. Perfect.
Ok, ¿qué tal? Las tengo. ¿Cómo están todos? Buenos días. Voy a controlar un poco el tiempo para no pasarme. Muchas gracias a todos. Buenos días. Un saludo del Ministerio de Vivienda, Construcción y Saneamiento en Perú. Mi nombre es Max Carvajal y yo soy el director de saneamiento. Es una precisión. En Perú, saneamiento significa o toma la acepción de agua y saneamiento, como en algunos países en la región. Yo quería conversar muy rápidamente sobre los ODS 6, 1, 2 y 3. Voy a concentrarme en el 3. Solamente haré una muy breve referencia en este punto. Pasamos de objetivos de desarrollo del milenio a objetivos de desarrollo sostenible, pasando de concentrarnos en coberturas a concentrarnos en otros aspectos adicionales a esto, más exigentes, como se ha planteado en los ODS. En el Perú, los ODS los reporta la Autoridad Nacional del Agua, es el punto focal en el caso peruano, y el Ministerio de Vivienda, Construcción y Saneamiento brinda valores para los indicadores 6.1, 6.2 y 6.3 dentro de este ODS 6. Esto solo lo voy a pasar muy rápido, y es que tenemos un avance interesante en estos 3 indicadores de los ODS. Solo mencionar que hemos avanzado no solo a registrar y reportar cobertura, sino agregar a esto continuidad y calidad, y estamos trabajando para también incorporar aspectos de asequibilidad. Siempre hay que tener un poco de cuidado con este punto de cloro residual, porque el cómo se recoge la muestra implica algunos retos importantes, ¿no? Esto es importante mencionarlo de nuestro lado, porque en el caso peruano el aspecto de calidad es el que define finalmente el valor del indicador 6.1. Mencionar solamente que esto lo estamos trabajando no solamente con el Ministerio de Vivienda, el INEI, sino también con el Ministerio de Salud a través del DIGESA, que recoge otros varios indicadores además de correo residual. Otra cuestión que se tiene disponible y que estamos trabajando en ello es el tema del gasto mensual en agua, además del gasto total de los hogares, y esto implica que podemos recoger indicadores de asequibilidad al servicio en cuanto a pago, y esto diferenciarlo, por ejemplo, por quintiles de ingreso. Ahora sí, me concentro rápidamente en los indicadores 6.2 y 6.3.1, que recogen el porcentaje de la población que utiliza saneamiento gestionada de forma segura y porcentaje de la población o proporción de aguas residuales tratadas de manera segura. En el 2015 se hizo un estudio muy grande en Perú. En el 2015 este estudio se ha actualizado, pero quiero primero mencionar el estudio base. Este estudio recogió información de todas las plantas de agua residual en el país, ¿no? Y con este estudio se ha venido trabajando en los últimos años. Menciono rápidamente fuentes de información y valores para ello. Para el 2015, la población nacional era de aproximadamente 31 millones de hogares, personas, en el caso peruano. Nótese que esto viene de una fuente de información que es la ENAPRES. La ENAPRES es la encuesta nacional de programas presupuestales. Hay un micro que se ha abierto. Es encuesta nacional de programas presupuestales. 31 millones de personas. De ellos, en el 2015, 21 millones tienen o tenían acceso a la red de alcantarillado. Esta información es entonces de encuestas. Esta información es la encuesta nacional de programas presupuestales. Esta información entonces es obtenida del Instituto Nacional de Estadística e Informática. Esta es una encuesta nacional a nivel urbano-rural que recoge varios aspectos, además de acceso a servicios de saneamiento, ¿no? Entonces tenemos a un 70% de la población accediendo al alcantarillado sanitario. De esta población que accede al alcantarillado, tenemos aguas residuales que van camino a tratamiento o disposición final, ¿no? Esto se ha calculado a partir de la cantidad de volumen de agua residual dividido por el valor del agua residual generada por persona por día. ¿Cómo es esto? Es básicamente recoger el valor de dotación de agua potable, se multiplica por un factor, en este caso 80%, y tenemos estos 162 litros persona día o litros habitante día generado por persona en aguas residuales. Es una manera indirecta de recogerlo, y con ello tenemos un aproximado entonces de 16 millones de personas que dirigirían estas aguas, de las cuales se dirigirían aguas residuales hacia su tratamiento o hacia su vertimiento final. Tener en cuenta que todo el agua que se genera, todo el agua residual que se genera va hacia una planta de tratamiento, pero no necesariamente las plantas de tratamiento que existen o que en este momento existían tenían la capacidad de tratar toda esa agua. Entonces, este primer número que vemos por aquí, en el numerador, nos muestra la capacidad de las plantas de aguas residuales. Otra vez utilizamos el mismo factor para tener cuánto genera de agua residual una persona por día, y con eso tenemos un aproximado de cuánta agua residual generada en redes para la población se está tratando en una planta de tratamiento de agua residual o en una estación depuradora. Tengamos en cuenta, acá voy a mencionar un aspecto que es importante, y es que esta agua residual que estamos contemplando en esta explicación son aguas municipales o domésticas, ¿no? También es cierto que en la ciudad vamos a encontrar otros tipos de usuarios, como por ejemplo usuarios comerciales o usuarios industriales, en una pequeña proporción. Casi el 95% de las conexiones de las empresas de agua en el país son domésticas, y los usuarios no domésticos tienen una normativa específica para cumplir con ciertos parámetros antes de que ellos puedan hacer vertimiento de sus aguas residuales a la red de alcantarillado. Esa normativa en el Perú es la normativa de valores máximos admisibles, que está vigente desde hace varios años y que ha tenido algunas modificaciones. La modificación vigente es la del año 2019. Ahora bien, de estas aguas residuales, entonces, que van a una planta de tratamiento de agua residual, no todas tienen un tratamiento efectivo. Una porción de ellas tiene tratamiento efectivo y esa porción nos lleva a este valor de pasar de 15 millones, de 15.8 millones de habitantes que tienen un agua residual que se trata, a 13.7 millones, que es el valor que tenemos por este lado. Con estos datos se pueden definir los indicadores 621 y 631A, que están en el orden en que estaban en el 2015, en el orden del 44% para el 621 y 62.8% respectivamente. Voy a hablar muy rápidamente, para no pasarme del tiempo, de la actualización que se ha hecho recientemente para el 2019. Los valores han cambiado y hay que tener en cuenta que esta lámina es solamente para el ámbito urbano. Estamos trabajando el caso rural para tener valores nacionales. Los montos pueden haber variado un poco. Mencionar que en este proceso entonces participa el Instituto Nacional de Estadística e Informática para la data de encuestas, por ejemplo, o la data poblacional. Participa la Superintendencia Nacional de Servicios de Saneamiento, el regulador de los servicios de saneamiento en el Perú, y participa el Ministerio de Vivienda, Construcción y Saneamiento en este valor de cuánto porcentaje de aguas residuales tiene un tratamiento efectivo, ¿no? Esto se ha hecho recientemente a partir de un estudio de 44 plantas de aguas residuales en el país, y el valor ha estado alrededor de 84%, para ser más preciso, 83.85%, con lo que el indicador 621 de este año, 2019, en el ámbito rural, alcanzaría el 58.9%, que serían el total de personas de las cuales su agua residual es tratada de forma segura, y el indicador 631, 65.3, que estaría recogiéndonos el total de la población. Creo que lo he dicho al revés. El 621 estaría recogiéndose el total de la población, cuántos están recibiendo agua de forma segura, los 15 millones que tienen el tratamiento efectivo de aguas residuales versus el total de la población en el ámbito urbano, y el 6.3, los 15 millones que tienen tratamiento efectivo de agua residual dividido por el total de personas que tienen agua, acceso a alcantarillado por red pública.
Thanks, Mr. Gramajo. If you could just wrap it up in one more minute so we have time for our colleague from Zambia.
Perfecto. Sí. Cerramos con esto, menos de un minuto. En principio estamos trabajando hacia adelante en una creación de una comisión multisectorial de servicios de saneamiento, teniendo en cuenta que este trabajo es multisectorial. Estamos adaptando la metodología ODS a nuestro caso particular, estamos incorporando estos indicadores en nuestro plan de saneamiento, estamos trabajando en la determinación de la brecha de información en nuestro país, estamos implementando un módulo de monitoreo de ODS y estamos haciendo seguimiento, estamos programando hacer seguimiento a esto en los siguientes años. No quiero dejar pasar la oportunidad solo de mencionar que también estamos haciendo un monitoreo epidemiológico de aguas residuales en 2 ciudades, en las más grandes del país, en Lima y en Arequipa, entonces durante todo el año, y ese trabajo es un trabajo articulado también con el Ministerio de Salud. El reto es muy grande, pero estamos trabajando muy comprometidos para lograrlo. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación.
Thank you. And again, I'm really sorry to rush because it's another very rich example of a very strong data set in Peru, and also an example of further development from your baseline in 2015 to the update in 2019 and your plans for the future. I would like to give the microphone to Peter Mutale from Zambia for just a few minutes, and I apologize, Peter, that we don't have the time that we planned earlier. But if you could take just a few minutes to describe how Zambia is approaching monitoring of 6.3, both for sewer and on-site sanitation, and then we'll close the meeting directly after that. Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Rick, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. I'll not share my presentation. I think maybe next time. Maybe just an overview quickly. In Zambia, we do have one ministry, which is looking at water resources management, water supply and sanitation, and also environmental protection. So there are three regulators under one ministry. And these three regulators are the ones that are responsible actually for monitoring this SDG 6.3. Just maybe to mention quickly, in terms of ambient, which is not our discussion here, we have already moved in this area. We have divided our country into 6 catchments, and we are observing these catchments. We have developed ambient quality standards. Quantities that are going there, the compliance in terms of quality. But on our side, as a